Hi, everyone. This is Jen Coppin, the Marketing Manager at Global PMI Partners. And I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar on Program Health Checks. I'm just going to wait a little bit until we have some more people attending. It looks like we have some more people popping on. Just a reminder, our webinars are aimed to improve your M&A integration knowledge and capabilities so that you can build lasting domestic and cross-border businesses. So please be sure to check out our past webinars and sign up for future ones on our website, GPMIP.com. I'll talk briefly about these webinars and how to register at the end of this presentation. Welcome to those joining again. And let's get started. If you have any questions during this webinar, please type them into the Q&A box. It should be located on the top or bottom of your screen, and we'll address as many as we can during the Q&A portion. A reminder that a recording will also be available afterwards on our website. I'd like to introduce our presenters. Chris Charlton is one of our partners in London. Chris is an experienced board advisor and leader in M&A and has been published by the Financial Times on subjects related to business strategy and M&A integration. Michael Holm is our partner in the Nordics. Michael has led post-merger integration and carve-out projects for corporations and private equity firms across multiple industries. He has also co-authored the book Cross-Border Mergers and Acquisitions. For further information, we offer the books mentioned as well as other books by our partners on our website. And for those just joining, welcome to the webinar. I now turn it over to Chris Charlton.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jen. And a warm welcome to everyone who's carved out some time in their diary to join us today for this webinar on M&A program health checks. As much as I'd love to spend time telling you more about Global PMI Partners, of course, that's not the subject today, but just to give you a quick flavor, we're a specialist consulting firm that wholly focus on the M&A field and provide all of our services related to mostly in the post-deal space, including, of course, integrations, but also carve-outs, and indeed work with many of our clients on capability building around their M&A activity. We're located in a number of different countries around the world, led by a team of 9 partners across the globe. I personally look after the UK business with my fellow partner in the UK. We have 2 in the US, Michael, who will be co-presenting with me today from the Nordics, and then in a range of other territories, including Canada, China, and spread across continental Europe. But our network extends far beyond those locations, and working with our clients both on domestic transactions and on cross-border transactions. We would, of course, if you want to know more about us as a firm and what we do, I would encourage you to visit our services page on our website, which tells you more about what we do. And of course, feel free to get in touch with any one of us if you'd like to find out more about us and what we do with our clients. If we could move on, Jen. This just gives you a bit of a flavor. Clearly, the subject today is based on our experience of all the transactions that we've been involved in, and the integrations and carve-out programs thereof. We've worked with many major brand names over the years. We work with companies large and small, and it's fair to say that there's no deal that's too large or too small for us to help work with. And a lot of the knowledge that we built up over that time, we'll try and get across in short order today. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, clearly the subject which we're talking about is health checks, and that experience, as I said, comes from all of these programs, but it also comes from not just integration type programs and carve-out type programs, but also broader business transformation programs, because a lot of what we do in integration work is really all about best practice program management. So a lot of that thinking comes from other types of programs as well. I'll be talking through our approach to program health checks, and then I'll hand over to Michael, who will talk about some of the key factors when looking at IMOs. So moving on. So why do health checks? And we get all sorts of questions, and those of you that are familiar with integration activity and running integrations, we often say that doing the deal is kind of the easy bit, and then handing over from deal team to the integration team. The integration team have the harder challenge, and we always find ourselves faced with the situation when we're in front of boards or steercos, being challenged with many of these questions that are listed on this slide. For example, we get asked the question, how do we know that we're following best practice? How do we know that our integration program is appropriate for the style and complexity of the integration in hand and the deal that we're trying to do and the value that we're trying to extract? How do we make sure that we're set up for success? Some of the typical challenges on the right side of this slide come from general projects as well as integration projects, and these are the sort of common thoughts that we get from our clients in particular. Is how do we know that we are actually capturing lessons learned from previous integrations? Many of our clients, many organizations do many acquisitions, as well as those that tend to do it more on a one-off basis. But nonetheless, we don't embed that capability and that thinking and that knowledge and that experience into the program that we're currently focused on. Equally, some of the program sponsors we work with, often at the most senior levels in our clients, don't actually realize that they have a responsibility to ensure that they have set up the integration program for success and give their respective boards reassurance that we are indeed set up for success. Often we find, and the reason we do health checks, particularly in integration scenarios, is for a simple reason, is that most organizations are experienced to a greater or lesser degree in doing projects, but not that experienced in doing them of the scale and complexity that is inherent in integrations. As anyone knows who is experienced in integration, the uniqueness of integration programs is the sheer scale and complexity of them. They do have a very strong habit of touching many different aspects, if not all aspects of an organization, from top to bottom and in every location and every function. So enabling our clients to get a really good grasp of that is fundamentally important. Moving on, Jen. I'm guessing, and this is a couple of key bullet points here, which really just trying to summarize some of the key findings from many of the health checks that we've done, and indeed many of our client programs that we work with. And for those experienced in integrations, I'm sure some of this will resonate. These are some of the sort of key success criteria that we're really looking for when doing some form of health check, whether that's being conducted internally and a sort of self health check, or whether it's being conducted with some external support, such as through Global PMI Partners. So some of these success criteria, clearly single ownership and leadership and accountability for all aspects of the program, not just the program overall, but each of the individual work streams that are set up to deliver the functional integration, as well as the integration of different businesses, and ensuring that the new combined business post-integration absolutely has got the leadership that it needs, making sure that there are the appropriate skills and capabilities, and most importantly, the capacity given to each of the members of the project team. And in fact, I'm working with a client right now on it's setting up an integration, and this is a very normal part of the conversation, which is ensuring that we give sufficient bandwidth to those senior leaders that not only have businesses to run and day jobs to do, but also have integration to handle. So capacity is a really important part of setting up for success. And then good project management principles in terms of having the daily, weekly, monthly discipline to stay on top of all of the various different moving parts. And importantly, being able to prioritize what are the most important value drivers for that specific integration, and keeping a really important lens on that as we go. Moving on, Jim. So why do a health check? And I'll start with the sort of point at the end is we get asked to do health checks at varying different stages of integration execution. Sometimes we get asked to help at the very beginning in the mobilization phase to ensure that programs get set up for success. And in fact, we'll come on to, when I come on to talk about our framework for health checks a bit later, I personally use that to, when I'm setting up a program myself, to ensure that I'm covering all the bases, to make sure that we're doing that. It can also happen midway through execution, and indeed for a major complex integration, which is going to take place over many months, then there may be a case for doing it 1 or 2 times. And then there's an opportunity at the very end to ensure that all the key lessons learned from that integration get fed back into. So the point about why do health checks is it gives you an opportunity just to stop for a moment, just to reflect on where you are, what you're doing, and to get access to some external insight if that's appropriate, because not all health checks need to have external parties on it, but to be really clear about what the project's doing well, what it's not doing well, where areas can be fundamentally enhanced and refocused, and indeed resources reallocated. So typically a really short, sharp review gives you the benefit of a clear set of recommendations to give your integration program a great chance, or greater chance, of succeeding. So moving on, the health check framework we use is kind of summarized on this page. There's an awful lot more detail that sits underneath it. And to give you a feel for what this is all about, essentially, this is good program management generally, but also specifically in integration scenarios. And the green boxes on this slide are the 6 main areas that are the underlying causes of problems in many of the programs that we've seen that need to be enhanced in order to set up for success. So the framework is based around the knowledge of where the key challenges and the key problem areas are for any particular integration program. And just to talk briefly about each one of those, the first area is making sure there's absolute clarity around what the objectives and scope are for the program overall, and indeed the work streams within it. This is making sure that there's a clear line of sight from the overall rationale of the deal and the integration strategy. In some cases, the strategy is not to integrate at all, in which case the program looks and feels a lot different from where there are scenarios where obviously the integration in certain functions and in technology and all aspects of the business are coming together to create that new business. Equally, it's making sure that every work stream is really clear about what it's trying to achieve. That's wholly linked to the value drivers of the deal and the synergy targets that are set, and indeed continuously looking for opportunities to find additional value. It's also about looking at the overall complexity of individual work streams, projects within those work streams, and the integration overall. For many clients who do many deals, integrations will vary from relatively straightforward, easy things to do, through to those that are far more transformational in their nature, in that they are doubling or trebling or even quadrupling the size of the business, and therefore the operating model for the business might be fundamentally shifted as a consequence of the deal. So really understanding the objectives and scope of the integration is really key. Governance, of course, is really important because of all of those different moving parts, because you're bringing 2 or more businesses together, many of which, in fact, most of which of the people will never have worked together before. then there's an enhanced requirement to ensure that the clarity of governance and decision making as the business comes together and during the planning phases in advance of a transaction close before execution gets underway is really, really important, because many of the key decisions, particularly about key roles and key people and key things around the operating model for the new combined business, all need to be taken coherently together. Of course, in a pre-close environment, making sure that stays the right side of antitrust and competition rules, and obviously also in the execution period. It looks at things around making sure everyone's clear about their roles and responsibilities as it pertains to the project, but also underneath that, because obviously bringing two businesses together, everyone's got to be clear about roles and responsibilities for business as usual as much as the project as well. And the link between business as usual decision making and project type decision making has to be crystal clear. That's the second area. The third area is really all about skills, capabilities, and capacity. And this is covering a whole range of different topics, from have we got sufficient bandwidth in the project team as well as business as usual to deliver the integration successfully, whilst ensuring the business continues to deliver and perform in the market as everyone hopes it will, to make sure that the incentivization arrangements for people involved in integration for retention purposes is fundamentally thought through, and there are clear mechanisms for that. Performance management is an important area, as is training. Many people will come to integrations with lots of previous experience, but equally many people in organizations will be experiencing the integration for the first time. So to invest some time in the team that is driving integration, either in different functions, whether it be HR, finance, and technology, or in business divisions, is always a worthwhile investment in time, effort, and energy. It also makes sure that the supplier landscape, both in terms of suppliers that are supporting the integration itself, but also the wider supplier base for the business as a whole, to make sure today's expectation and indeed planning for future capabilities is clearly thought through. So those are the sort of first three areas that we definitely look at when conducting a health check. Then the bottom three is really all about the financials. Firstly, on the left, that's about making sure that cost synergies, revenue synergies, and indeed other intangible benefits of bringing businesses together is clearly understood. There's a clear line of sight from project delivery and execution of the work in order to realize those benefits, and then how that gets translated into profit and loss accounts and into balance sheets is really important. And having a clear tracking mechanism to make sure everyone is held to account and honestly gets appraised for delivering against those synergies. In those publicly listed companies, clearly there are market expectations that need to be managed. Project approach, and this is something that we certainly recommend in the vast majority of integration scenarios, is to be really programmatic around the style and approach for getting stuff done. It's a very good way to make sure complexity is managed and to ensure that everyone is clearly up to speed with what's going on. We don't recommend sort of detailed bureaucratic approaches, but sufficient discipline to ensure that everything can get done at pace and decisions can get made. The other box is kind of the catch-all, and that will typically be refined for the specific scenario and specific integration program that we might be looking at. Typically, it will cover things like business change. It will look at the technical solutions that are being identified, as well as the operating model and business solutions that are being put in place. So hopefully that gives you a very quick rundown around the framework that we look at. 6 key themes. Underneath that, just to move on to next slide if I can, Jen. We have a range of tools that sit underneath it, but to give you a feel for how long should you expect a health check to take, the short answer to that is typically, even for some of the more complex integration programs and major complex programs, a decent health check review should take somewhere between 3 and 5 days, only for the most complex should it extend into a second week. Because an experienced reviewer in both planning the review and then undertaking the review typically will take a couple of days really just to pour through all the documentation that exists in and around the program to understand that, and then to interview some key stakeholders with different perspectives on the integration program itself to get a cross-section of views and opinions of the integration and how well it's proceeding. Clearly, the most significant time commitment is for the program sponsors and the program managers and workstream leaders who typically will all be involved in that. So all told, within three to 10 days, depending on scale and complexity, you should have the findings and recommendations all prioritized out the back end. Just moving on, Jen. Just to give you a quick insight, we have a reasonably extensive toolbox which we will choose to use in some instances, but not in every instance. Fundamentally, this is just giving us some additional data points and providing a mechanism when we get to the end point of the review, where we would typically sit down and have a workshop with all of the key stakeholders involved to really discuss the findings, discuss the recommendations, and talk about complexity. Because we know that financial scale is not a good indication of how difficult an integration will be to deliver. We use this complexity tool to help give us that insight. And there are 12 key complexity factors that we take a look at. And this model has now got data points from hundreds of programs. So we can give you really good insight into where are the likely risks going to crop up for each of your work streams and for the integration as a whole. Where are the key capabilities that you're going to need based on each of these factors? We have an assurance review tool as well, which gives a sort of detailed questionnaire to allow us to get through those stakeholder interviews really quickly and to get this very holistic, rapid view of the program very quickly. Just to give you a couple of examples of how that complexity tool is used, moving on, Jen, if I can. The first on the left side of this page is sometimes we use it to compare different integration programs as a whole. So where we have clients that work on multiple acquisitions and therefore multiple integrations, to get a very quick sense of, is this going to be easier or harder to do than the last one? This is a really easy and quick way for us to come up with that assessment. Equally, it also allows us to forecast forward for future deals how the integration strategy links to the complexity of the program in terms of its delivery, and therefore what kind of team needs to be stood up to deliver it. On the right-hand side is just an example of where we get much deeper into the integration program, actually doing that complexity analysis for each of the work streams that make up the integration, and then comparing and contrasting to provide us this heat map of where the risks are likely to occur. And the pictures on this page are actually from a real deal from about 24 months ago. Just moving on, Jen. The final tool, and this is an optional thing, and it depends on what scope is being asked of us, is sometimes, obviously, project management is at the heart of successful integration management. And we have this tool as an extra tool that really just looks in a similar way to our complexity tool at project management capability, both at a work stream level, but also at a overall program level. And this just gives us some interesting insight and data points to feed back as part of the findings of the recommendations. So moving on, Jen. So all of this comes together in short, sharp view in a summary report, and there are many different styles of that report, but typically it's pretty brief, very focused on a prioritized set of actions, using our RAG indicators to point out where there are areas of particular attention and focus, and importantly, comparing that to the scenarios that we find in other integrations. Depending on when the HealthCheck is undertaken, we will then give you a view as to where you should be versus where you are today. So it gives you a bit of a feel for the sort of report. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour for what we do around program health checks. I'll now hand over to Michael to just cover some of the key points related to IMOs. Michael.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jen. And so this is Michael Holm, Nordic partner at Global PMI Partners. So I'll talk about 6 lessons that we have learned and the most key lessons from doing health checks. So just going through this slide with you, this is a typical M&A integration value model. And you can see on the blue, that's kind of business as usual. In blue, the orange or yellow is then operational excellence, and green is then value creation. And this model, we have not included any dis-synergies that sometimes can happen because of you have to let go of a unit due to regulatory requirements or any other costs that's unforeseen that is lowering the business case, perhaps cannibalization of channels and things like that. But the value capture in this picture is then the operational excellence. How to consolidate the operations, how to reduce expenditure for third parties, release some duplicate unnecessary assets that release value for you. You re-engineer business processes to be more effective, and you leverage your best practices across the 2 units that's merging. So that's the value capture for this. So then moving on and thinking a little bit sorry, Jen, go back. Moving on to value creation was what I'm going to say, is to then look at things that would increase revenue and margin that you're not doing today in either of the companies, to change the portfolio and to increase the performance of your portfolio. Again, this is not something where you can use the excellence that resides in the companies that is merging. And the last one is then to change the rules. And across this, it's extremely important to have joint incentivization. That means that everybody's aligned, both the target and the acquirer, towards the goal and the objectives. And that there's a clear hander of what the deal team saw, the objectives and the value that they saw from this deal, and that is handed over to the integration team. So when the IMO gets this in its lap, sometimes I call it the spaghetti. You turn a bowl of spaghetti upside down in your lap, and you have to figure out first, is it carbonara, or is it bolognese, or is it pesto? You have to follow each of the spaghetti threads from the beginning and to end. So now you have a project. You have to look at value capture and value creation. And you have to continuously look at the project or the program and the underlying sub-projects that they are prioritized. So do they create value? Are they a must-have from regulatory requirements, or are they nice to have? So you always focus the integration and the team around creating the value. And what we see typically in health checks is that those are things where it's harder to align the 2 companies on what the vision is, what the objective should be. And when we come in to do these health checks, while you always look at the nice to haves and sometimes the must to have some regulatory requirements. So you're just creating the value, and that comes much later on in the IMO process. So that's what we find in health checks. Another one is to look, as Chris was talking about, that they have a clear ownership, accountability, and capacity. So we look at those projects and that they're set up for success, that it's streamlined from the top down. And we usually say that good integration are built top down. So you have to have that governance, and you have to align at the top what is the vision, what is the objectives, and what is the value to be created, and that has to then filter down throughout into the IMO and the different work streams in the IMO. Of course, then you would like to measure how well you're doing towards the value. And here it's very good to link the project KPIs with the company KPIs. So an easy one, if you measure on EBITDA, then you should measure the value capture on EBITDA, etc., etc. So you take the set of KPIs that the two companies have, you merge them for business as usual, and then you relate them to the integration project KPIs. It's also that the need in an IMO to be synchronization across the different work stream and the different parts of the project in terms of what resources they have, what is the impact of them, and you have to filter that up to concise management and executive reports regarding governance. Because if you don't that, you kind of, you send in a value creation initiative that you should increase sales or you should reduce cost, and you kind of, it's lost at sea. So you have to have that feedback mechanism, both on a functional level as well as cross-functional level, and to measure the value to be created. What you have to look at then is you have to do the cost benefit. So how much does it cost for the combined entity to go after that value creation? The deal team had an idea and they didn't have all the data available. So the IMO has to take in all the real data and involve the organization in revisiting and validating that benefit will be received and it makes sense. You have to make that cost benefit analysis for each of the value. And you have to remove things from both kind of business as usual and from what was thought to be able to create value. So you have projects or sub-projects, you have to pause them, you have to table them, and you have to prove that so that you really, really are focused on a doable task in execution when you get to the closing. So when on to the target company. So this is explaining a little bit about the picture, and the key words here is incentivization, alignment, I call it, that's easier for me to say, and the handover between the deal team and the integration team, to continuously look at the cost benefit, to really have a good governance of the complexity of all parts that is part of the integration, and to link the project benefits with the company KPIs, project KPIs with company KPIs, and to look and synchronize with dependency across the different work streams in the project, and last but not least, and to remove things that are not important, nice to haves, and leave those for later, but focus on the value creation and what is needed, the must-haves, because of regulatory requirements. So moving on. So that was a long slide, and the next slides in the lessons learned are more simple. So this is the key success factors, is another lesson that we learned. And here is a 7-step model to look at those success factors and to move throughout them then. We talked about the first one, a shared vision, alignment. The second one is then a quick start. And this is where you have to have a very drive, and you have to have a set of criteria of who you want to be with the target, as well as with the workstream project, that you have to have a mobilization of who you want to be involved, and that it's not too junior. There's people that has to have the mandate to carry things through, and to look at that. The third one is to have a holistic approach and to look at the whole core process or the co-flow through the company. And we normally say that other people's leading practices works best in other people's companies. So you cannot cherry pick in the middle of a process and put that into the acquirer's business process. You have to look at it from a holistic approach. The fourth thing is to have aspirational targets. What has been said in the press release is probably the CEO that has said that this is what I can deliver upon. But in order to deliver upon that, the IMO and the integration has to set higher targets in order to ensure that you deliver at least what is being said in the press release. And that is normally a little bit of sandbagged. So you have to lift your eyes a little bit and have more aspirational targets. The fifth key success factor is build on trust. This is a very sensitive period of time. People will be more moving around, getting new roles in the organization. The gravitas is moving perhaps from the target to the acquirer of who is deciding things. So there has to be openness and trust. And you have to have a very good rhetoric and very good communication. So creating that trust is just as important as creating the right business design. So trust is with people and the software issues and the people issues. You have to invest, number 6 here, in the project leadership skills and other skills in the team. You cannot expect people to come from a line management role and just drop them into a highly driven integration project without getting some additional skills. Not everybody has been doing this. Not everybody are comfortable in doing this. So if you take the wider base of people involved in the IMO and train them and invest in them, both in what are the actual vision, what are the technical things involved in the two combined entity, but also talk about change in project leadership skills in order for them to fulfill their roles as sub-project leaders or workstream leaders. And last but not least then is to focus on execution. So strategy is of course key, but it's very, very important to have a fast-paced execution. You don't want to be in project mode forever. And if you have the senior people in the integration management office with mandates, you can then apply the 80-20 approach. You don't have to analyze everything until you're 100 to 120% sure that a junior would approach this. It's better than to analyze it to 80%, and then you use your experience and your knowledge of the company to come to an execution decision. So the key words here is the alignment, it's the speed and ramping up, it's the holistic approach, it's to have those high targets above the press release, it's to demystify the integration and the trust, and to invest in the people in doing this. Don't just throw them out there into the deep sea. Invest in them and tell them what to do. And then the 80-20 approach and rule. So Jen, moving on to lesson number 3. So people and people-related factors. So most integration failures, 9 out of 10 reasons are people-related. And some of those people-related issues are on this slide. But most companies, they identify the right solution, but a lot fewer are able to delivering on the expected value, as we can see from statistics. And that is, in our view, poor implementation, and in our view, I should also say from our experience and from the health checks we've done, is the execution that fails most integration. So people will say, we've done the deal, it just happened, you know, let's just leave it with the operational people and they'll figure out how to combine this in the best way, because that's what operational people do. No, you need to have more attention to issues related to leadership, to see the politics that forms when you combine, especially when there's two larger organizations combining. You have to look at retention to keep the key people. You have to coordinate certain things in the marketplace towards suppliers. You have to have a clarity of roles across the company, so you know what a sales manager is in both companies. And you cannot have a loss of focus on business as usual. You have to follow the business plan, you have to deliver on your quotas, and you have to have move on with that business. So 9 out of 10 reasons are people related, forming into leadership, people, communication, culture, and change. Pre-deal analysis is normally okay. It's execution that fails. That's what we found in our health checks. Handover is a source of issues between the deal team. So that comes in addition to the people relation issues, but sometimes it's part of the leadership as well to set up that handover and to do that effectively. And delivering value is then harder than doing the deal. So you have there the Vickers model to the right. I believe we have a webinar or we'll have a webinar on Vickers coming up soon. It's talking about vision, incentives, culture, action, resources, and skills. So you have to have all of those 6 in order to move on with your people-related factors. So thanks, Jen. Moving on to lesson number 4. Lesson number 4 is then the IMO approach. And you have to have a project office approach. And what we find when we go into health checks is that we find a weak PMO or a weak integration management office is very reactive. It is not proactive. It's not looking at anything but merging the IT function with the IT function, the sales function with the sales function, the marketing function with the marketing function of the other company. So it's looking from a very functional driven way of looking at it, and it's just mechanically doing a process without an analysis. So you have to be agile in your analysis. You have to adopt your IMO to the deal and to the deal rationale. And that's typically what we find in the worst IMOs or project management office. Also what we find is there's a lack of cross-program support. The people that's driving the IMO doesn't have time or skills to look at those cross-program issues that arise, the dependency, the interdependencies. They don't look at risk management and mitigation, and they're very bureaucratic of it. They follow a process very, very rigidly, and that's not what you want in an IMO. If you look then at the next one, the proactive IMO, it's very focused on value. It's looking at the governance and the business. It's looking at the strategic decisions of the companies at the whole and as the integration, and facilitating those decisions for the combined company as well as managing risk is in a very good way. And of course, it supports the delivery of the different tasks. So it supports the different work streams, is involved in the discussions in the work stream, is really the proactive spider in the net. And it also is looking after continuous improvements. What you can call then the Nirvana or the integration PMO IMO is then very much into excellence and operational excellence or IMO excellence. And it's a very fast-paced, intense IMO with planning, reporting, setting momentum, getting people active in decisions, in moving along towards the value rather than being reactive or just being proactive. It's really the driver and behind the whole integration. And it challenged the work streams of their decisions. It really has that business understanding of the combined company and the value to be created, that it can challenge the work streams and take the spider the net a little bit further regarding how to create that, that value. So above the value capture, it's going into value creation, and the IMO then supports that. And it has an additional set of tools as its disposal, checklist, tools around the future operating blueprint or the company blueprint, charters and checklists for the work streams, as well as in case of carve-outs, transitional service agreements. So moving on to lesson number 5. How mature does your IMO capabilities need to be? And we find sometimes that we come in, it's either too much or too little. You have the setting up the IMO has been based on the last transaction that might have been a smaller one or a larger one, and the wheel just keeps on turning the same way as been done before. So this is what we find, and you have to in each IMO scope it to understand what you should do in the pre-close and the execution phase, and have core IMO capabilities that you do in every transaction. And then you have some additional focus in the execution phase to really to have the high performance. And you have to select perhaps not all of those in the high performance, but those that are relevant for the actual deal that you're working on. And the way we look at this, and then with that we classify the IMO when we come in and do a health check to see if there is an awareness, if there is repeatability, if everything is defined, the disciplines that are defined of how to do things, if it's well managed, and the level 5 then if it's optimized towards the deal rationale, the companies, and towards the best practices that we can see in the industry from our practice and our 300 some integrations. So that's the IMO maturity level scale that you have there on the right. And we normally look at this, going back also to the other lesson that we had on the slide before regarding the IMO approach. So we normally work in 4 dimensions when we do the integration. We work in the functional dimension, we work in the core business process and flows and applications dimension, the IT dimension. We work with geography because you want to reach all the different subsidiaries that your company has. Sometimes IMO is very centrally headquarters focused, and you have to work with culture across these geographies, across the business processes, and across the functions. And those things you have to have in your capabilities and in a mature capability set of your IMO, and you have to know when to use them for large and small IMO and acquisitions. So moving on to my last slide, talking about day 1 planning focus. And here is where you get those 4 functions into play: function, process, geography, and cultures, and the lessons learned, how to plan ahead of day 1. And day 1 is when sometimes the deal is also made public. It's the closing day when you get full access to the target. So the lessons learned that I've talked about around this is to focus the IMO of the value, and that should then be ready to kick off and be ready to be executed upon at day 1. So all the functional day 1 priorities on statutory and legal requirements, the critical day 1 enablers to start the value creation and value capture, and the functional integration priorities. All those should be prioritized and ready, and everybody should know that. Also, the different workstream priorities to set up to deliver both value and functional value, as well as the different changes that are needing to the overall operating model of the company. So all of those lessons is to have lesson 6 is to have the focus on the day one planning. And just to then wrap up and to go through the 6 key lessons learned: focus the IMO on value. We talked about the vision throughout to the execution, the 7 key success factors. We talked about the people factors. We talked that the IMO is different from other project managements, and the maturity of the IMO and how to go from a reactive, proactive to IMO PMO excellence. And you have to look at how mature does your IMO need to be for the deal that you're working on. And the last lesson is to always have the day one in focus for what you do in the pre-closing phase. So turning over to you, Jen. Or Chris, sorry.
Thanks very much, Michael. And just to wrap up, just a couple of extra thoughts here. There's a lot of material on this slide. I won't go through, but just to sort of wind back, you know, we've really covered some of the scenarios around why bother doing a health check. And I'll leave you with this thought, is that we typically invest an awful lot of time, effort and energy in due diligence in the deal phase. But yet we know all the risk is in execution during the actual integration phase. So the recommendation here is to, in the same way that we invest in due diligence, to invest a short, sharp health check on a regular basis, just to keep the integration on track and to make sure that we haven't missed any opportunities to ensure that the program gets set up for success. We've covered a little bit around our framework and key lessons that Michael just summarized. In terms of key benefits, we've covered some of those. One question I often get asked is should we do it internally or should we use someone externally to do the health check? And I suggest that either are perfectly reasonable and fair and give you a good outcome. The extra 2 things that going external gives you, one is avoidance of optimism bias, and of course independence, because obviously self-assessments always are subject to that. And secondly, it gives you that access to many previous integrations in many different sectors, and that additional piece of knowledge is always very helpful. And of course, if you're interested to learn more about health checks and how we do that, or any of our other services, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with any one of us. So thanks very much for listening to the core element of that. We still do have some time left for some questions, and I'll hand back to Jen just to manage that Q&A process.
Thank you, Chris and Michael. We do have some questions, and everyone, please be sure to type your questions into the Q&A box if you have some as well. When we have, how large does an integration need to be to warrant a health check? Chris, would you like to speak on that one?
Sure, that's a great question. I guess the general rule of thumb is any scale of integration can warrant a health check. If it is a really small, simple, bolt-on type acquisition, then I would suggest a health check can be conducted in a day. For the more complex deals, then obviously it a bit more involved and requires a lot more structure and thought to get through. But I would suggest that any deal size can warrant a health check internally, or indeed with the addition of external insight can be a benefit. The bigger it is, obviously, the more important that is, because it has a more significant impact on the bottom line of the overall combined business. So the investment case for doing it is much clearer the bigger the deal is.
Thanks, Chris. Another question we have, what are the most typical integration challenges where companies struggle? Michael, do you want to talk on that one?
Yes, sure. So I think is the creating of that momentum. It's partly, the leadership of the project, and partly is the project complexity in setting up the IMO to create that momentum that kicks in after day one. So that is one of the typical challenges. The another one is to align the leadership. to really ensure that everybody from the top down, from the top management to the people actively involved in the integration are aligned on what needs to be achieved and what is the end goal and the end state that you're trying to reach. So alignment on that leadership is very important. Normally it's middle management that actually executes the integration. And then the third one, which is the typical integration challenge, are people issues. So the leadership, communication, leadership involvement throughout the process, communication, culture, and change. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Michael. Actually, a follow-up to that question as well. Is a health check something your IMO should be able to do?
So shall I have a go at that one, Jen? Again, it's a great question. And in scenarios where organizations are doing an integration and unlikely to do many more, so the sort of one-off scenario, it would probably be an unreasonable expectation for an IMO to be able to do a health check. So in those scenarios, often finding some external support is helpful. For organizations that are typical serial acquirers, doing acquisitions on a regular basis, every year, there are 1, 2 or more deals going on. I personally think it is a key and core capability for an IMO function that is managing successive acquisitions to be able to do that objective independent health check to make sure integrations stay on track and to ensure there's this feedback loop back into new and future acquisitions.
Thanks, Chris. Another question we have, do you find that program teams can react badly towards a review? Michael, would you like to take that one?
Sure. I mean, it's hard to say and to answer. Of course, generally they do not. I mean, generally they have a sense that they might have not covered all the bases. They're not entirely comfortable, and that's why the executives calls in the health check. So generally they do not. I mean, it happens. It has to land the right way. It has to be put to them right way, and it's not intrusive of, or stopping them from what they're doing. And it adds value to them. They can see the point in it. So no, I don't think that that is the case.
Yeah, and just to build on those thoughts, Michael. Certainly my experience is generally providing the style and approach of the person or people conducting the review is one of constructive capability building. It's not about finger pointing and blame, because in some health check scenarios, obviously the health check is being triggered because the program is failing to deliver, or certainly not delivering at the speed that the boards or sponsors or execs would require. So the style and approach of the reviewer is really important to ensure that that isn't the case, because clearly the aim of the game is to build on the good work that is being done and then to identify room for improvement and priority actions to help steer them back to a good place. So keeping it positive and constructive is always the best way to help avoid that.
Thanks, Chris. I think we have time for one more. What is the main benefit of carrying out an independent review versus a self-assessment? Would you like to take that, Chris?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I sort of touched on that. I guess it's a good, reasonable best practice for any program, integration or otherwise, to particularly those that extend over many months, to take the opportunity every now and again just to stop, take a brain check and actually take a look at the program, what's working well, what's not, and look for ways, reaching out to the whole team that's involved in it and indeed wider stakeholders that are impacted by it to get thoughts and ideas about how things can be improved. So that sort of continuous improvement mindset. So internally should be just a natural way of doing things. And then it's a question of, if you want that additional lens in terms of independence, the avoidance of optimism bias, as I called it, and indeed the access to that knowledge base and experience based on many hundreds of previous integrations, then it's worth looking at external options, which is a reasonably low cost way, given it's just a couple of days to get access to that type of knowledge. It's always a worthwhile thing to consider.
Great. Thank you, everyone. This concludes our webinar. You'll receive an email with links to his presentation and a short survey that enters you into our draw. Please visit gpmip.com/connect and mark your calendars for our upcoming webinars. If you enjoy social media, please head over to LinkedIn or Twitter and follow us. Thank you, everyone.